Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and what has been an unashamedly light week. I spent 2 evenings in a row in the pub, and why the hell not, eh? But anyway, the women of the US Army and how they were trained and prepared for duty and service in the war is the subject of today. Molly Sampson, historian and creator of the fabulous Lipstick and War website, is my guest. I'll bring her in now. Good afternoon, Molly. How are you today?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you for having me.
I'm glad you're here, and we've just talked 688. We've talked representation in movies. We've talked about the accuracy of movies, and as we will be talking today, getting that understanding that the war is made up of all these different aspects of people of different colors and both sexes, etc., etc. It seems to be a kind of an ongoing battle to make sure people realize that, as I say, every nation was involved, and you're kind of paving the way in this regard. So before we get going with your PowerPoint, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this talking about World War II malarkey.
So I grew up doing living history, reenactments, whatever term you want to use, with my parents as a kid. I thought that's how you had to go camping. And my brother, when he was a teenager, there's a 4-H project on living history. And he wanted to portray our grandfather, who served in civil affairs in the European theater of operations during the war. And he drugged me out to an event, and I'm like, nobody's reenacting World War II. It's too modern, it's too new. Come back to a real time period like the War of 1812 or the American Revolution. But I went with him and absolutely fell in love with it. I have been eating my words for almost 20 years now. And he was so into it that I wanted to hang out with him. My little brother's my best friend. We have a lot of shared mutual friends. So I was trying to find some way I could be involved and hang out with all my buddies. So I tripped my way into the Women's Army Corps. I was like, oh, they're not nurses. I don't have to be a war correspondent. Cool. Women's Army Corps, let me start digging into this and learning everything I can. And then it just kind of snowballed from there and became all encompassing. Before the pandemic, I had one of the largest all-female units in the reenacting world, representing the Women's Army Corps. And then since the pandemic, I've shifted almost entirely to more academic pursuits, presentations, conferences, things like that. And did an exhibit on the 6888 at the former 6th Cavalry Museum, a Triple Victory, the 6888, focusing on their overarching story, but especially on the 2 weeks they spent at extended field service training at Fort Oglethorpe, because that's where the museum was located. And then from there, once the Congressional Gold Medal bill was passed, effort on Tyler Perry's movie really got traction. And they went to Fort Oglethorpe to scout out what they could, saw my exhibit, and got my contact information and invited me to help work on the movie. So that was a really interesting experience, working with Hollywood and how they interpret history versus how I usually interpret history in the museum world or in articles. Was really interesting. And
I mean, we had Kevin on talking about that, and it, as we see, it gave a bit of a spotlight on that unit and helped nudge things along the way. But like all Hollywood movies, people look at it and go, "Well, that was good. That bit was less than good." But anyway, we're glad you're here. So you've come on with your PowerPoint, and folks, fire away with questions. So we're hoping this is going to be the first of several appearances from Molly doing different aspects of WACs and their continued service around the world. But this is kind of a foundational show where we're talking about how it was all set up and, as we say in the title, the training. So I'm going to hand it over to you. And if you have questions, folks, do feel free to kind of fire away and we will address them. But I'm handing over to Molly.
So yeah, we're going to talk about, I've named this From Civilians to Soldiers, training the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and the Women's Army Corps between 1942 and 1945. Really how we took women who had been excluded from military service for so long and turned them into GI Janes. So in the beginning of the war, before we even fully entered, we are realizing that we're headed towards war. And in May of 1941, Congresswoman Edith Norris Rogers of Massachusetts introduces H.R. 4906. And this is a bill to create a Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And this really comes from experiences from the First World War. So Rogers had served in the Red Cross during World War I, and her husband had been a congressman. After he passed away, she took over that seat. I call that the Edith Wilson loophole that we see in the interwar period in the States, of women taking over their husbands' jobs once they become incapacitated or pass away. And she had advocated, once she got into office, for recognition and recompense from the federal government for women who had served during World War One. And one of the biggest groups that led to this was the Hello Girls and Army dietitians and physical therapists. So the Hello Girls were telephone operators that were requested by General Pershing to head to France to serve on switchboards because the doughboys who had been working in the Signal Corps were not succeeding at effective and efficient phone connections, and using French civilians led to too much of a language barrier, that it wasn't really ameliorating that. However, these women who had been told, you're in the Army now, here are your uniforms, they were close to the front, they stayed overseas. The last Hello Girl didn't come back until 1920. Once they got back stateside, they said, okay, how do we sign up to get our pensions? And they were told, oh, well, you actually weren't in the Army. You were civilian contractors and you were paid as such. Like, go back home, be wives and mothers. So Edith Norris Rogers sees all of this happening. She fights to get recognition, to have medical bills covered, and it's not really happening. At the same time, in the interwar period, we have a study pulled up by future General Hughes, and it's on how women could be incorporated into the US Army in support roles. But it doesn't really go anywhere. There's not a lot of interest. We're done with the Great War. We're never going to have a war like that again. Obviously, those words age like milk. But once we start getting geared up before we even fully enter the war, Rogers finds this study, pulls it back, and goes, hey, we could work with this. So she uses that to introduce the bill, but it doesn't go anywhere. It fights its way through committees all summer of 41, early fall. And at one point, the director of the Bureau of the Budget even says, there will not be a need for a women's Army Auxiliary Corps in as much as there will never be a crisis in the limited manpower service field. So the manpower crisis happened pretty quickly. And it wasn't until after the attack on Pearl Harbor that a renewed sense of energy on bringing women into support roles, because we have to rapidly expand our military, happens. And General George C. Marshall even says, like, let's make this happen. So between December 8th and December 30th, Rogers rewrites the bill and reintroduces it as HR 6293. And they immediately begin work with pre-planners and what they're going to do. And these pre-planners are working on everything from rank structure to what the uniforms are going to look like, including what color stockings the women are going to wear. That was a big deal. To what we're going to talk about today, how are we going to train the women, and how this training doctrine that the Army has gotten really good at in the last few decades can be applied to women. So May 14th, 1942, Congress approves the bill creating the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. May 15th, President Roosevelt signs it into law. And the very next day, we get our first WAC, Oveta Culp Hobby. Now, Hobby had a really impressive background. She had been a parliamentarian with the Texas State House. She married former governor of Texas, William Pettus Hobby. And then she also became a newspaper editor and had all of these really great skills that, as we enter the war and we begin the draft, the War Department has a women's interest section. And it's really a liaison between the War Department to the wives, mothers, sisters, girlfriends of servicemen, and how we can help calm women's concerns about military service, and how we can take this, masculine Army talk and package it to women. So she was already known to the federal government from this. When the committee and the pre-planners are discussing who is going to be our first director of the WAC, her name was the only one put forward. So she starts a press tour immediately upon taking her oath of enlistment, and she has handouts discussing all of the important topics that you would need to know to become a WAC, or if you want to share the information, like the enlistment standards, what the pay is going to be, when it's going to start, what the first uniforms are going to look like. And the only questions she's getting are women going to be allowed to wear makeup? Can they date officers? Will they be issued girdles? Like, all of the newspaper headlines are focusing on all of the most silly things that are not consequential, but it's what the people want to know according to the media. So she is fighting this, but at the same time, she's on a one-woman recruiting tour almost, working with civilian organizations to start recruiting for the first training class. So she is going around. They expect that they're going to get a few thousand applications for the first class. And the first class, they have set 440 slots for officer candidates. And then after they get those women in, they have slots selected for the first enlisted women to become the initial cadre for the training center at Fort Des Moines, Iowa. So the recruiting actually went gangbusters. They got in excess of 25,000 requests for applications from women, which was about what they were authorized for full. Like if they would have taken everybody who had asked for one, they would have filled out the ranks they were authorized for at that point, and the WAC would have hit terminal mass immediately.
Wow.
But they narrowed it down from there and started working really quickly. Like April is when they really dug into starting the training, planning, and getting everything geared up.
And at this point, Molly, had there been any looking across the Atlantic? You know, we often talk about the fact that obviously the UK is at war considerably earlier than the USA, and Poland, of course, had it even earlier. Are they looking at any kind of European models, or the fact that other nations have been using women in different roles, or is it all kind of very much from within the USA and the USA's own vision of this project?
Much like we have done everything in our history from the invention of American democracy on, we heavily plagiarized it,
Right.
mostly from the Brits and a little bit from the Canadians. So even the name, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, came from British Women's Services in World War I.
Yeah.
And then a lot of what we were doing, our structure, was copied off of the Auxiliary Territorial Service.
Yeah.
And then the Canadian Women's Army Corps. And those two were like the two big factors. And if you even look at the Canadian Women's Army Corps, their branch insignia is also the Pallas Athena. They just went for more of a Greek style, where the US has more of a Roman style. But if you look at it, it's heavily like copy paste, and I'm just going to write my name on it, slap the US Army logo on stuff as I can. And I almost think they didn't go far enough in copying. Like, had they copied a little harder, they could have been a little more successful. So there was never any conscription for the Women's Army Corps. It was all volunteer. And then to join, you had to be between 21 and 45 years of age. You had to, they preferred you to have a college degree or equivalent experience, but that got lessened as the war went on and they needed more and more women to join. You could be married. You could have kids if they were over the age of 16. They later lowered that to 14. Or if you could guarantee that someone else could take over raising your children for you. And the best example of that is Oveta Culp Hobby herself. Her two kids were under the age of 14 when she took the director position. And she was really concerned about it. She almost didn't take the position because she thought that she needed to raise her children and stick to those responsibilities. And her husband, who was not really known for being a progressive man, I mean, he was governor of Texas in the early 20th century, not a progressive, told her that he could not do as much for the country as she could in this position. He was much older than she was, had actually been friends with her dad, and it was a bit of a scandal when they started dating. But that he would stay home, he would raise the kids, he'd be stay-at-home dad, so she could go join the army and run the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And just really, it worked out really well that way for her. And I mentioned briefly, I'll get back to that before I forget it. I made an offhand comment about the badge of the Army. Because they were auxiliaries, they actually weren't in the Army, they were with the Army. They had relative rank, it wasn't full military rank. Their rank structure, they used the same Army terms, but their official rank structure was first leader, second leader for non-commissioned officers. And then for officers, it was first officer, second officer, third officer. And then Oveta Culp Hobby's rank, if you see there, she's wearing full bird colonel rank, but her official rank was director. So there was this push and pull between, are they in the Army, are they with the Army, are they separate, are they part of us, and it created more problems than it really solved as they went along.
Yeah.
So as we're in this pre-planning and then immediately post this getting passed, but before we start actually bringing women into the actual training site, we have this man, Don C. Faith, and he was crucial to how training was formed for the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. So the goal of WAC training was to make available the responsibilities and the skills of the women of the United States to the U.S. Army for defense and service of the nation. And Faith strongly believed that that should be the guiding principle, and whenever possible, to make the concept of women in uniform more palatable, everything should be rooted in the training that already existed for men. Now, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps were non-combatants. They were not to be involved in combat. They were not to carry arms. That got a little fuzzy later on, but officially non-combatants were not armed. So the training was this, well, what do we do with all the hours that we put men in combat training with the WAC? So Faith has his work cut out for him. He is in the middle of Iowa at Fort Des Moines. It's a former cavalry post, and he's trying to switch stables and the barracks and everything over there to be WAC barracks. The stables become classrooms, and they actually pretty quickly outgrow it and have to bring tents and things in what's called Boomtown. And he's fighting the limits of them being auxiliaries and the red tape and the bureaucracy of the War Department of making requests for things. And he's getting, a lot of times it's like the leftovers. They're not getting first dibs on anything. It's, well, we have these training officers who we haven't assigned anywhere else, so you can have these men to be your first training cadre. Oh, you need more paperwork? Well, let's run around and try to figure out who is actually going to get you the training paperwork and the training materials you need. And it was like one logistical struggle after another. I don't know that this is Clausewitz's definition of friction, but there was definitely friction going on. But Faith really, really, really thought that this had potential and was a great supporter. I mean, he had been career Army man, and so switching over to training women in this experimental kind of role was a big deal. So, I mentioned Hobby taking her oath of office and going on recruiting. And this is kind of how they were showing things, is the first women that they're pulling in, they're showing off that they're the every woman of America. They're in their lovely suits, their furs, their Oveta Culp Hobby was known for her great scents and hats. And then she joins the WAC and gets this god-awful Kepi style hat for the rest of the war. But the women they're picking, they really want the cream of the crop because of all of the concerns while they're trying to create the WAC, that what's wrong with these women? Why do they want to join the Army in this role and not become nurses? Nursing was a protected status. It was caretaking. It's what women are supposed to do. Why do these women want to become G.I. Jane? There were concerns that they were just joining, and we were going to create a generation of Amazons who wanted nothing more than to order men around. So from the get-go, they're like, okay, we need to fight those rumors. And how can we do this? So they pick the first 440 women. They get them all set up, and they arrive in Fort Des Moines in July. And this is what they're going to be studying. So they had a 4-week training program at the beginning. And this is going to cover everything from they show up, they get their uniforms, because there's not induction in processing centers that are separate. Everything happens at the training center. So they have 20 hours for processing there, military customs and courtesies. They have their own regulations because they're an auxiliary. A lot of things that are same as the men: military sanitation, defense against chemical attack, map reading, interior guard duty. One of the things I really like is the companies and parades. If you look at Nancy Shea's book, The WACs, which was kind of a know before you go volume that was published in early 1943, she quotes an Army officer unnamed, but women love parades was kind of the recurring theme of, if we can't hand them a gun and fill their time with that, what else can we do? Well, women like parades, let's just put them in parades. And then, other things, spare hours, fire drill, stuff like that. So we're taking women that have no prior experience, no tradition in the US Army, and after 156 hours, we're spitting out trained officers that are going to start training the next women. And they do it. So between July 20th and August 29th, 1942, only 2 women out of the original officer class wash out. So 438 of the 440 women graduate, and 24 hours later are teaching the next group of women. And there's discussions about how they're adjusting, and the male officers and NCOs in training are bragging about these first groups of women, that they are so dedicated to proving themselves, that they belong in the Army, that they're spending their leisure time afterwards practicing drill. They said they're doing more than the men that they've been training. Now, the downside of this, because it wasn't all like, oh, they were succeeding and excelling at everything, is you have these women who almost all have college degrees, and you have male training officers who are very green themselves. They are just graduating, and they've never actually put any of that training into practice in classrooms before. And you have women making comments of, well, they meant well, but they kept getting corrected. Or one of their senior officers would come in and gently guide the lieutenant into what he actually meant to be saying. And then, because it's officer candidate school, they have to all be recommended for receiving their commission. And if they don't receive that recommendation, they don't get it. And that continues through the history of the WAC, even after the training changes a little bit. But what they're finding out is the women are ranking themselves completely differently than the male training officers are ranking the classes. And the women are ranking each other based on who is showing the best responsibility, who's the best team player. And some of the male officers are ranking the women based off of who is young and cute, and who they think they have a chance at dating. And it became enough of a problem that those were the male officers that they eliminated first and reassigned elsewhere.
Right.
So
just a quick question for you, Molly, because you said that a lot of them have got college degrees. So you said that obviously that they haven't had prior experience of the Army way, but they have got prior experience, if they've been at college, of an inequality in how it works being in an organization. So when you say that they know they have to work harder, some of them would have known that from their college era. They would have known that from previous organizations and clubs, that as a woman in the 1930s, 40s, you have to work that much harder just to be recognized. Is that correct?
Yeah. And a lot of them had not only been in college, but also had actively been in the workforce as well. So they were used to that.
They've been in an environment that's been unfair, and they know, and they've prospered because they've been able to deal with it to some extent.
Yes. And again, that the first group of women, they received thousands and thousands and thousands of applications. So they cherry picked the ones who they knew were going to have the best go of things, the best chance of success. And then the next classes were like that second tier, and they went through that until early September, and they started getting just general groups of women coming in. But they went through those first few within a handful of training cycles that were just like the very initial women that came in. And the esprit de corps and how excited they are to make a positive effort is summed up. Betty Bandel eventually became head of the Air WACs during the war, and she was deputy director of the WAC for a short period. She was assistant to Oveta Culp Hobby, but she wrote a telegram to her mother the first day of training, and she said, happily and amazingly in the Army after one short day, eating, marching, and listening. And a lot of their experiences were very similar to the men's. They were dealing with dust. They were dealing with marching long hours. subpar food, because I don't know that anybody gets excited about army rations. But at the same time, they had their own struggles. Like one of
Mm.
my favorites to talk about is they're marching the same amount as the men, but they have to do it in heels. The men did not. And that 1.5-inch heel does make a difference after a couple hours.
That's a
And
Ginger
they're dealing.
Rogers quote, isn't it, about Fred Astaire, isn't it?
Yes,
Everything
yeah,
Fred
yeah,
Astaire did,
yeah.
I did it
So
backwards and in heels. Yeah.
yes, yeah, yeah. They might not have been doing it backwards, but those about faces and heels are a little different. And then you have Charity Adams, the first Black woman
Yeah.
to receive a commission in the same training class. And she talks about how she was aware of the differences, not just the men's army versus the women's army, but within the women's army, because the army is segregated at this time. So the WAC, as the auxiliary, is following the same 10% rule segregation that the army at large has in place. And she and the other women in her training platoon are aware that as soon as they got there, they were separated out into a segregated training platoon. They had segregated tables, everything like that. So she's also pushing really, really hard in the I have to prove myself twice as much. So they graduate August 29th, 1942, and they get this wonderful visit from Oveta Culp Hobby, giving them this great call to arms of, the lights of tradition are dim, but you have a date with duty, a date with destiny, and a date with democracy, a debt to democracy. And basically telling all the women that they're the first ones to have a formal enlisted place with the US Army, not nurses with relative rank, and that they're the make or break. And they are representing all of the women of America during this time of crisis. And it's really one of the best speeches I've ever read. I wish there was a recording of it I could listen to, but I encourage everyone to go read the speech at some point if you get a chance. So we talked about Fort Des Moines being the first training center. We end the glut of the first round of training in early fall 1942, and we're switching over to really gearing up of recruiting drives, and we're outgrowing Fort Des Moines. We have enough women officers trained that we can start looking at other training centers staffed with WAC training officers. And we're looking at where we can go next. And at the same time, we are getting this horrible winter in the plains area of the US. And I tell anybody, if they've read Little House on the Prairie, that the winters they talk about in Little House on the Prairie are the same winters that are happening in September of 1942. Winter came early that year. And so the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps hasn't even gotten all of their uniforms yet. They are running on just those summer uniforms. Here, Oveta Culp Hobby in the center there is wearing the summer uniform. The two training officers on the far right, same thing, summer uniform. The rest of the women
Yeah.
are wearing their fatigue uniforms, which are seersucker. So they don't have anything warm that's been issued to them yet. And the Quartermaster Corps is hitting snags on supplying the winter uniforms. So they get a last batch of men's overcoats, and Elizabeth Pollock published the first WAC memoir in 43. She had been at Des Moines through Boomtown, and then after basic training stayed there for administrative school. And she talks about seeing the WACs running around in the overcoats looking kind of like one of the dwarfs from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs with the long sleeves hanging
Yeah.
down, making fun of them. And like no one was in any semblance of a uniform or regulation because they're just layering what they have. And it's getting so bad that WACs are washing out of basic training because they're getting pneumonia and sick because they can't stay warm enough.
Oh.
So at the same time, we're looking at where else can we send them? So Daytona Beach, Florida is selected as the site for the second WAC training center because it's far enough south that you don't need winter uniforms. They could get away with summer uniforms and be fine and not get sick. The other interesting thing about this is it was the site of Mary McLeod Bethune's school. She was part of the WAC pre-planner. She was very influential on the creation of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. She was born to parents who had been enslaved, and made her life about education and activism. So she had a school there. She was part of the pre-planner. She's like, hey, I have this great place. I know about it. I have ins with the community. Let's send WACs there. And they didn't have any established military buildings or anything there. There was not an installation there previously. So they took over hotels and civic buildings throughout the community. And that was how the second WAC Training Center, and there's gorgeous photos of the women driving Jeeps up and down the beach. And they're doing all of the swim training in the ocean and all of these like really great things that you don't see anywhere else, just nature of where it is. And that site trained about 28,000 trainees. And then the third WAC Training Center opened in January of 1943. That one's my favorite, Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, just south of Chattanooga, Tennessee. And it's actually on the grounds of Chickamauga Battlefield. And that became the largest WAC training center inland, and trained the second highest amount of trainees after the first WAC Training Center at Fort Des Moines. Also in spring of 43, we opened the fourth and fifth training centers. Training Center 4 is at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, and it operated until August of 43. And then Training Center 5 was an exercise in what not to do. So it was located at Camps Ruston, Polk, and Monticello, in between Arkansas and Louisiana. There was 100 miles if you did the route between all three of them. It would take you about 100 miles to go amongst them. So not great in terms of logistics. The women were housed in tar paper shacks that had been built to house POWs. And it was kind of an insult to have these women who volunteered to serve be stationed in the same buildings that we were putting prisoners of war. So between that and all the logistical nightmare, they closed that one in 3 months and moved everything back to Fort Oglethorpe at the third WAC Training Center.
Okay, just a question that came in. We've got several building up. There's one that came in, I think is pertinent with that slide up there from David, about changes occurring in the wider US Army to eventually accommodate the fact women are going to be coming through, you know, hospitals, things like that, because, you know, obviously the male army is segregated. There's certain things you can't put men and women in the same place just for practical reasons. So is while at the moment, while they're in training, they're in large groups together. So as you're saying, they're converting hotels, but eventually they're going to be kind of released into the wild, so to speak. Is the US Army beginning to think about how the fact they're just going to manage that on a purely practical level?
So I'll use Fort Oglethorpe as the example. Fort Oglethorpe had been a cavalry training post before the Women's Army Corps took over. And at the start of World War II had also been an induction center for men, and it kept a separate cantonment area and station complement unit for the men. So there was still an area of the post that was for men, and even the post commandant was a man. So they had separated areas. The women at Fort Oglethorpe greatly outnumbered the men. But even as we start sending women out to duty stations across the US and then even overseas at the end of 42, beginning of 43, they're sent out with their own separated area. So there's photos of WAC area restricted, keep out. We have accounts from WACs in France on, you know, about a month and a half after D-Day, talking about that their areas guarded by MPs. And I think it's Frances DeBra Brown, writing in An Army in Skirts, talks about the fact that she didn't even realize that the MPs were there until in the middle of the night on a latrine run, she starts to slip in the mud and a hand comes out and catches her and helps her walk the rest of the way to the latrines. Women were also even more protected in the South Pacific and separated from the men. They talk about having their areas surrounded by barbed wire and fences, and they were fenced off from the men. So they were kept separate. And I think there was a benefit of the Army Nurse Corps being in existence for 40 plus years at this point,
Yeah.
that the Army was used to small groups of women being with them, around them. And it was almost the WAC, despite being the much younger sister of the Army Nurse Corps, made things easier for the nurses later on. So in 1944, the Army Nurse Corps finally loses relative rank and they're granted full rank within the US Army. And part of it is because the year before, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps had dropped the auxiliary status and had become full members of the Army.
Yeah, you get that kind of same thing in Britain, with each service kind of nudging what is allowable and possible a little bit further. So then the other one then nudges it a bit further. So the Women's Land Army and the Wrens and the ATS, they're all kind of pushing it. And if it becomes okay for one, then the next one can, well, we better allow it as well. And I guess the same thing's happening your side of the Atlantic. It's just a gradual moving up of the bars on the graph.
Yes, and moving outside of the Army. So the Navy Nurse Corps had also been in existence for decades at this point. They were created in 1908. So you get the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, May of 42. And then July of 42, the Navy comes along with the WAVES, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, following very much what the WAC are doing. It's support roles, not nursing. And then the Coast Guard comes along with the SPARS, Semper Paratus, Always Ready. And then finally the Marine Corps, kicking and screaming, because that's how they make any changes, finally come along and they're like, all right, cool, we'll bring women in, even though they had been ordered to at the same time as the Navy. They're part of the Navy during wartime. And they finally come around and start bringing women into the USMC Women's Reserve. And it was like all of those things happening at once. But I like to joke that the Navy held off because they had the bill about the same time the WAC bill was being done, but they hit pause. And I really think they just wanted to watch the Army struggle, figure out where the pain points were, and then avoid those when they finally did. And it fast tracked much, much more smoothly than the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps bill did.
Thank you.
So this is digging in a little bit more to the Third WAC Training Center. So here's an example of the barracks the women were in. These are all photos from what was called the South Post. And the South Post was very much on Chickamauga battlefield, but this kind of shows you how an existing fort was turned over to the WAC. So the parade ground you see there in that kind of oblongy trapezoid shape, that is where the 6th Cavalry had been posted before the war. Much of its officers' houses, there's some cavalry troop houses. The area north of that was mostly stables. To the east, you had what had been a civilian conservation corps camp. And then part of the POW camp was there, but that was staging, extended field service training there. And then south was much of the basic training facilities. They had a theater on the South Post. There were no men stationed on the South Post at this time. They were all in the North Post. They have their own church, the camp library is there, so they could really be their own tiny little city. And once we start replacing a lot of the men as training officers, if you were on the South Post in your 6 week of basic training, you might not see a GI until you go on leave or have to go into staging or you're sent to your duty station. So it really was, they were using men as training cadre and support only as long as absolutely necessary, and then replacing them with women. So as we're going through things, as we've dropped the auxiliary status and as we're learning more about what works in training and what doesn't work in training, it becomes an iterative process. They add a 5th week in 43, and they finally add a 6th week. So that 4-week training that the first class went through, they end up adding 2 more weeks and over 100 hours of training to the cycle to bring it in line with men. So what changed is, I'd mentioned earlier, the women didn't have separate processing and induction centers. So they have a week at a reception center to handle a lot of that. And part of that involves the indoctrination in the beginning of things. And then they have a week at staging and processing as well. So here's kind of a comparison with what the final training class was versus what the men's were. So again, there's a lot of time in ceremonies and parades that the men don't get. There's more time in personal hygiene and military sanitation. There's more time in first aid. That's the one I've always questioned, is why are we giving women who are going to be rear echelon support roles more time learning first aid than the men who are actually going to be in combat? I don't know. Someday I'll find the answer for that one. But it's interesting to see what was viewed as very important. And as the war goes on, they lower the recruiting standards a little bit for the women coming in. They are realizing that the manpower crisis they were told in 41 would never happen is happening, and they want to bring 150,000 women in. Now, the Army Air Forces was advocating for 1 million women. They loved the WAC. They were part of the first ones to get women in duty stations at aircraft warning services. And then the first WACs in Europe were assigned to the 8th Air Force. The Army Air Force loved women. They wanted more women. And part of that was because of working with the British Women's Services so effectively in 42. But the British women assigned to the 8th Air Force needed to go back to the RAF and working with their own. So that's when they brought the Women's Army Corps members over. So they're pushing for 1 million women. How do we add more and add more? Well, we can't get more women in if we keep everything so strict. So they start accepting women who are testing lower on the Army General Classification test. And that leads to a need of spending more time in orientation, in indoctrination, teaching them about the organization of the Army, how all of this works. And then once they have them more comfortable with it, then they can dig into the rest of training. And there's extra hours for makeup and review to help with that as well. So Faith said, he tried to make sure with the training and all of the changes that it was emphasizing the things that the Army found most important: punctiliousness, neatness in dress, and a sense of duty to the U.S. Army and a pride in service. So a lot of it was very much the same. But they also came up with WAC-specific training programs and materials. A lot of these weren't published until later on in the war. You don't get a lot of stuff the get-go. So WAC Life was a women-specific alternative to FM 21-100, which was the basic training for the men. And this is really, really interesting. Great read. It's available online. And it really shows you the push and pull between, you're in the Army now, but don't forget you're a woman first. And there's a whole section on your morale will be better if you take the time to make yourself look good. Maintain your femininity. It is important to be feminine. Do your hair. You'll feel better. Doesn't matter if you're homesick. You'll get past it. It also redoes some of the drill because things that weren't considered until we have women actually doing them is when you drop your hand from a salute, you have to make sure to not slap your skirts. You got to hold your arm out a little bit farther than the men would, so you're not flipping your skirt around too much. There was also a lot of concerns that women weren't physically fit enough for the rigors of Army life. So the only field manual that was created for the Women's Army Corps is FM 3520 WAC Physical Training. And it's how to build up your endurance, but there's a lot of I think every third page is reminding you to not get too bulky. You don't want to be too muscular. You don't want to be those scary Amazon women, but you need to have enough endurance to handle a 8-mile march with a full pack. You need to have enough endurance to climb up and down the side of a ship if needed. And then my favorite part of the WAC physical training is its first iteration was put out by the Infantry Journal. And the last 6 pages of it are, here's how to style your hair, here's how to do your makeup. If you have an oval face, put your blush here. If your hair is short, you can try this style, and here's the setting pattern for it, which is very helpful for living history. if you're
Yeah,
trying to do
yeah.
this, lived experience thing. But at the
Randomly.
same
Yeah,
time,
yeah.
I'm like, there's a war on, and this is what we're focusing on. And then the one that was the biggest deal during the war was the sex hygiene course, which they called social hygiene on everything except the manual itself. And there were so many concerns about the venereal disease rate that the GIs had had that, matched what the doughboys had had in the previous war. How are we going to handle that with women? Because men can't get pregnant, but women can. And a pregnant WAC is a big logistical nightmare. How are we going to move her? So if you got pregnant as a member of the Women's Army Corps and you were married, it was a medical discharge, but you couldn't stay in. Like it was automatic out, but it was classified as a medical discharge. If you were unmarried, it was a dishonorable discharge.
Wow.
Um, which is, interesting and not something you see in the men's services because it just doesn't exist there. So this sex hygiene course focused not just on like what we all learned in sex ed as kids, but more of the social side effects of it and what the Army expectations were. And it was heavily restricted and they weren't allowed to talk about it with reporters. The media couldn't report on this. It was, inside voices only on it. But they came up with their own separate course, and it was heavily pushed, and then it was reiterated after training. There'd be circulars about it that are written in this very vague language, to the point that the first time I read one, I'm like, what are they talking about?
Mm.
Keep your feet on the ground. And then I realized it was keep your feet on the ground, don't be on your back kind of a thing.
And I'm
But it was
assuming,
so
Molly, that in like modern parallels, when awful people say, I don't know, women get sexually assaulted because they wear provocative clothing, in some ways they're kind of putting the blame on the women
mhm.
for
Oh, the
getting
onus
men
of
into the right. It's
responsibility.
not the GI's fault; it's the women's fault for getting in that situation. And you would be, your social misdemeanors would be depriving the front of a man if he gets VD, that kind of thing. I mean, I'm
Mhm.
assuming that's how it was worded in a very blaming the women kind of way.
Yes. Yeah, and the onus of responsibility was entirely on the WAC, and part of the reason that there was a gag order on it was so we start with the rumors of or concerns about the Amazons, women stepping out of social norms of femininity, of good American womanhood. So by 1943, this has kind of shifted, that it's not so much women joining just so they can order men around, but there's this pernicious rumor going on that ended up becoming called the slander campaign.
Yeah.
And there's an entire chapter in the official WAC history on the slander campaign. And basically what the slander was is they were asserting that WACs were their actual role within the Army was to serve as comfort women, that they were providing relief to the men. And you get trashy newspapers coming out with headlines that 20,000 WACs are returning stateside pregnant and riddled with venereal disease, um, all of these things. And it's at the same time as we're trying to grow the WAC exponentially, we're hitting this recruiting slump because women don't want to join because they don't want to be associated with those rumors. And it stuck around. This is very anecdotal, but that concept stuck in people's head. When my mom graduated high school in the 1970s, she wanted to join the WAC, and my grandma told her that good girls don't join the Army.
Wow.
So yeah, it really embedded itself in people's minds, and it got so bad that the War Department actually brought in the FBI to do a nationwide investigation to find out where these rumors are coming from, with the assumption that it was coming from like Nazi sleeper agents trying to undermine the US military. So the FBI does their investigation and the War Department goes, great, where are the Nazis? And the FBI goes, no, it's soldiers and their families, because the um, publicity they'd kind of been using was free a man to fight, release a man for combat. And these GIs didn't want to be sent into combat because a woman could, do a clerical job better. A woman could handle the motor transport jobs better. So if they spread these rumors and complained about them, maybe the women would stay home. And there's been a great program or a study project that came out during the pandemic using a lot of the morale reports and the surveys that were being done during the war. And you can read through one of the surveys they did was asking GIs what they felt about the WAC. And these are official Army surveys, and the men are not holding back at all. They're saying, like, I don't understand why the women are joining. We don't need them. They don't have to do anything over here. Like, why are they coming over here? They should stay home and work in the factories because that's where we actually need them. And you see that happening on the women's side as well. When they drop the auxiliary status in summer of 43, they're given a 90-day period to choose to stay in, meet the slight change in enlistment standards. There was a higher physical standard that was being required. And of the women who voluntarily left, most of them were giving, not that they weren't adjusting to Army life, but that they felt that they weren't wanted, that they weren't needed, and they could do more for the war effort elsewhere. So Violet Kokendorfer is an excellent example. She ended up writing her memoirs after the war, and she left the WAC, joined the Red Cross, and ended up going overseas with the Red Cross because she thought she could do more there than in the WAC. You have women going back into factory work because they thought that had a greater impact. Bit of an aside from training, but an interesting one that's happening, and it's impacting how women are experiencing service.
Yeah, I mean, we had a couple of questions. I mean, it makes sense that if you are a woman who has enlisted, volunteered to go and serve your country, and there's an avenue that apparently makes it look better, you can serve your country in a more obvious way. Shifting sideways. I mean, because when you're talking about the beginning of this program, the factories and things weren't at their full capacity. They were by kind of 43, 44. This is when the B-17s and 24s and tanks are being churned out. So there is a need for factory workers mid to late war that there perhaps hadn't been early in the war because the factories, in a sense, hadn't been built yet. So the US government is obviously balancing these various aspects of where will be the best place to use this additional workforce, as well as the women themselves. Which is interesting. I hadn't thought about that before. So thank you for putting that.
And it's not that I mean, obviously my specialty is Women's Army Corps. I don't want to make it sound that I'm saying that service in the WAC was better than. It really was. Everything was helping. Just what is the most fulfilling to you as an individual? Go do that.
And we had another question about, sorry to interrupt you, about the films. Scott Grimm had asked, so does Molly think that the short films about the WACs, We're in the Army Now and Women at War, were more to educate the general public and US Army about the WACs instead of recruiting? I mean, obviously they're serving several purposes, but were those films sort of countering this slander campaign to kind of emphasize professionalism, reassure the public, as well as encouraging women to go up and sign up?
Yes, and I don't think the educating general public was separate from recruiting. And if you look at a lot of the recruiting manuals, what recruiters were being taught, and what the Army, like the public relations were doing, it was very much, if we can teach the public about this, make it more comfortable to talk about, not an unknown, fear leads to hate, hate leads to the dark side kind of a thing, quote Star Wars. But if we make it more comfortable, we can also recruit at the same time. So there was a recruiting plan that they came up with in 43, and they based it off of Cleveland, Ohio. And the goal was they would use people in the neighborhoods to identify potential WACs, but they did this through calling up everybody, like phone trees through your neighborhood and talking about the WAC. And they put pamphlets out and things in the local newspapers talking about the WAC. So it was education and then recruitment. And they had, it was kind of a sales funnel of, if we talk to everybody in the neighborhood, we might get 1 or 2 WACs out of the neighborhood. And it ended up not being as successful as they hoped. I think they went through like 38,000 households and they got a couple dozen WACs, and they realized to get the number of WACs necessary using this plan, they'd have to talk to more households than were actually in the US. So not the best option there. But yes, and I'll tie back into films and things using this image. So there were also a whole bunch of other training things going on beyond basic training. So by 1944, they're advertising for 239 different occupational specialties. In actuality, it was closer to 400 different occupational specialties that WACs could do within the Army. And they had, some of those were on the job training, like some things you didn't need a separate training course for, but they did have specialized training courses happening at the WAC training centers. Cook's Baker School, administrative school, clerks training, medical technician, recruiters. But the one that got the most attention was motor transport. And there was just something really novel about women handling these large military vehicles. I mean, a lot of them ended up driving Jeeps, but you see a lot of jokes about deuce and a half, weapons carriers, those things like that. And part of the reason it got so much attention is also Hollywood got its claws into it. So this is a scene from one of my favorite movies ever. It's called Keep Your Powder Dry. It was put out by MGM in 1945, and it stars Lana Turner, Lorraine Day, and Susan Peters. Lana Turner's the poor little rich girl who is, had kind of a bratty life up to this point, but to get the last bit of her trust, she has to join the WAC or get a job. So she joins the WAC. And then you have Lorraine Day, who is the consummate Army brat. Her dad is career U.S. Army. She has lived on Army bases her whole life. And she's convinced she knows everything there is to know. And she's kind of the stuck-up know-it-all. And those two hate each other. And they are just cats and dogs all through basic training. And then you have Susan Peters, who is the sympathetic character. She has joined the WAC because her husband is serving overseas, and she's the mediator between the two. And you have a couple other side characters that pop in and out, but they do their basic training at Des Moines, and then they're given their assignments, and Susan Peters or Lorraine Day and Lana Turner both decide that they're going to show the other one, and they're going to pick motor transport school to get away from them. But they both thought the other one couldn't hack motor transport. So all three of them end up at Fort Oglethorpe at the motor transport school there. And here they are fixing a visiting general's staff car as he's driving around the base. Very cute movie, and actually filmed at Fort Oglethorpe. All of the extras you see in the background are WACs going through training or stationed at the training center. And they had three women who acted as stand-ins for the three main actresses. And it was very much yes, this is a fun movie. They compared it to The Women. I hesitate to say it was that good. It's kind of cheesy, but it's very, very much a propaganda film of look how great women's service is. And then the end of it has this wonderful, like, they're going off to do great things in the war and serve their country. So it was both like, let's entertain the public with showing what we're doing with the women, but also let's encourage women to join and recruit through there. And then we also have officer candidate school training. So at the beginning, the women went straight into OCS. But after the first few training classes, they had to go through basic training first and then be selected for OCS, which was an additional several weeks training. And then all of their classmates had to say, yes, they passed, no, they didn't. There's some great letters from a woman who washed out because she just didn't get along with anybody else in her OCS class. And reading her letters, I'm kind of like, well, the way you talk about them, I kind of see why you washed out. Like, I don't think I would elect you either, lady. So they have this wonderful being their own branch method of training everyone they need. And that once we start getting larger WAC units overseas, once we see the 3341st Signal Service Battalion, the 6888, they're not just the small casual detachments. They're very self-sufficient. Like they do not need men assigned to their units. They don't have to have a co-ed unit to become self-sufficient. They can handle everything themselves. This is kind of a fun little off thing. Other specialist schools outside of the WAC training centers that were open to WACs. They had admin schools that were the same ones the GIs went to, photo lab school. The radio schools are really interesting ones because they were run by civilian radio companies to train service members. And then the one that was most impressive out of this whole list really is the Command and General Staff School. So before the WAC, you usually had to have at least a decade of service in before you could be selected to go to Command and General Staff School. But there was no WAC that had 10 plus years of service during the war. So they start getting women who have only been in for 6 months but are excelling so much that they're going to these schools and they're attending them with other men. I believe they also lowered the requirements for men as we're gearing up and having more and more men joining the service during the war, you know, the draft and everything. But that was almost a watershed moment for them, that they're not lowering the standards, they're changing the standards. They're realizing that the barriers they had aren't serving them, and it makes it more egalitarian for everybody. And then this is also one of my favorite side topics. So training didn't just happen stateside, they also trained more overseas. It was a constant recurring reminding thing. But once we start moving women out of England into France, we realize we need some refresher training. So before women would go overseas to any theater, they would go through extended field service training. Fort Des Moines, Fort Oglethorpe were the two big ones, and it was a 2-week training period. You'd get uniforms reissued to you. You'd get any extra shots you needed. Most of it was shakedown, and then a little bit of a reminder of like defense against air attack, defense against chemical attack, those things that you'll need because you'll be closer to the front. So we have this buildup of women in England. D-Day happens. We've now taken over enough of France that July of 43, we're going to send WACs over. So middle of June 44, we have 110 women in London going through their own special overseas training. And I love this one because it's everything that WAC training wasn't supposed to be. They are marching in full field uniforms with full packs from Evelyn Mansions to Battersea Park. I did the walk casually on a London visit, and yeah, it's a nice walk, but I wasn't in full uniform or pack. So I can't attest to whether or not it would have been nice. They did tent pitching while they were there. And then one day a week, they rotated the group through a firearm familiarization course. Now, again, WACs were non-combatants. They weren't supposed to carry guns. They were not supposed to be armed. But they realized they're sending them so close to the front, and there's a chance that the front could move back and forth, that they want them to at least be somewhat comfortable. So the women are given training on M1 carbines. They shoot 10 rounds at the end of it, just so they know like what happens when you pull the trigger, and that's it. Now later on, you get some women who actually were armed, and they were carrying payroll, so they had a lot of money. There's a really famous photo that makes its rounds on the internet, Cagney and Lacey of the WAC, and you see one of them with a pistol on her hip. But this is one of my favorite, and the photo shown there is actually the women of Forward Echelon Communication Zone in Battersea Park, taking a little break to read through their French language books ahead of the transfer overseas.
I've got a friend who lives near there. I'll try and get them to match up that photo if it's still possible, or at least
that would
find
be great.
it.
I walked around and I was not seeing anything that looked familiar, so I just kind of parked it at one point and took some pictures. But yeah, it was really cool to be able to go like, oh, okay, here, and then finally put places to what I'd been reading. So basic training and the training centers themselves, to a part of this, like educate the public but also recruit, they really talked about them like they were summer camp, and it was this idealized collegiate all-girl experience, like you were in this special kind of sorority. Life magazine in September of 1942 did a huge spread on basic training at Fort Des Moines. The training centers came out with souvenir booklets that you could buy when you left. And it was very much a look at all the fun things we're doing at basic training. Look at all the sports we do. They really pushed the fact that every post had a beauty parlor. And the top right photo is a famous hairdresser that they brought in to then train the other hairdressers on what would make an Army specific hairstyle, and then teach the women, like, okay, once you're maybe stationed somewhere that doesn't have a post beauty parlor, here's how you can style your hair yourself. And it was really just this very idealized experience. Whether or not that was the actual lived experiences of the women, this was how it was being shown to everyone.
Yeah, yeah.
And then some more examples of some souvenir photos. These are all from Fort Oglethorpe, and you could buy them in a little pack. They'd come all together, but it was showing some of the different training classes that were going on there. Again, you get the WAC softball team, bunk inspection. My favorite one is the bottom middle, where they just have a giant table full of donuts in front of them. I joke that I'm going to recreate that photo at some point.
Enemy donut recognition is a very important bit of training. I jest, yeah. Donut recognition at different ranges.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, again, like it's showing that women are doing normal women things, but they're also doing abnormal women things. When you look up at the WAC convoy, and
Yeah.
it's all women drivers as part of the motor transport class. But again, like I love the fact that they made these into souvenirs that they could send home and say, here, look what I'm doing. Keep this for me
Yeah.
after the war, mom, dad, sibling, husband.
And it's like, even that, if you go back to that photo, those photos again, it's like, even when you were talking earlier about that, you know, makeup advice and how to cut your, there's like they're trying to kind of find this balance between showing them doing manly things and girly things. There's like a line they're trying to aim for, so to hit that balance of, oh, look, they are driving trucks, but they're also, you know, serving trays of donuts, or look at it. They're trying to hit a kind of a happy medium, I guess.
Yeah, they are competent soldiers, but they're also still women. Like we're not eliminating that social norm at all. It's still a safe thing to do, and they push it in some of the other recruiting videos. It's Your War Too is one of my favorite ones, also filmed at Fort Oglethorpe, but they talk about like rumors, not the slander campaign rumors, but that they can't wear makeup and they can't get stockings, and it's like, no, you're issued stockings. You can wear whatever makeup you want. Go get your manicures done. Go style your hair.
Thank you.
So as we're growing training and shifting things, we also have one of the best examples of a morale boost happening in April of 44 at Fort Oglethorpe, when Lieutenant Colonel Elizabeth Strayhorn takes over as the first female commandant of an Army training center. All of the other WAC training centers up until this point had been commanded by male officers. Now, once you started getting into the training regiments and things, it was all female, but at the very highest echelon of the training center, it was usually a man, and usually someone who was too old for direct combat service, had decades of service in. Hobart Brown had been the first commandant of the 3rd WAC Training Center, and he had served through World War I. He was really the creator of the military police training. And then once he took over Fort Oglethorpe, he created a WAC military police training course. It wasn't originally planned as part of it, but it was his thing that he was really into. And he's like, nope, we're going to make WAC MPs. So that was like a really interesting, like, you could tell he had pride of what he was doing. The man shaking Elizabeth Strayhorn's hand here is Howard Clark, also career infantry officer, did not like the WAC as much. And you can see the difference between the quotes from Hobart Brown and the quotes from Howard Clark. Clark kind of got saddled with this onus of responsibility versus viewing it as an opportunity or anything there. And a lot of changes happened after Strayhorn took over. There were some issues with fire watch and food supplies and things that were fixed pretty quickly after she took over. But at the same time, you have, I mentioned earlier, Charity Adams and this push and pull of, you know, the WACs had to prove themselves in the Army, but Black women had to prove themselves twice over. And the segregation issue continued throughout training. It really didn't start solving itself until it was smaller officer candidate classes or smaller other training things where they couldn't segregate out because it just didn't make sense when it was just a couple of women. But they talk about the dining hall at Fort Des Moines, the basic training center. When they would go to the cafeteria, the tables would be labeled like 5C, and the C stood for colored. And women start writing home and complaining. They write to the NAACP and complain. They write to Mary McLeod Bethune, who's shown in that top right photo with Harriet West. And she and the NAACP pushed back against the War Department, the Army, saying, like, why are you doing this? Why are you labeling them as such? So they took the C off, but kept the table segregated. Martha S. Putney, who served in the WAC during the war, and later wrote When the Nation Was in Need, A History of Black Women's Service. She talks about a woman being so antagonistic because this white Southern woman was not informed when she joined that she would have to serve alongside Black women. And so while we're having these wonderful steps forward in how women are able to serve, the things women are being allowed to do, stepping outside of what had been traditional women's jobs, you still have discrimination built and baked in.
Yeah.
And I talk, we've talked a lot about white WACs, black WACs, but there were WACs serving from other minorities as well. They just weren't classified as such. The Army enlistment records were not as nuanced as we have surveys things today. But Fort Oglethorpe had the biggest range of different women serving. So we have shown here is a group of WACs who had been recruited directly from Puerto Rico in September of 1944. They're brought over as a group to train at Fort Oglethorpe. They graduate together, and then they're assigned as a group to the New York point of embarkation, and they work processing mail and serving as censors, especially censoring any mail that had been written in Spanish. You had a group of Hawaiian WACs that came through. A lot of them were from Nisei descent, also at Fort Oglethorpe. And then my favorite headline of the other groups they had were they announced that they had Dutch WACs training, and they actually weren't WACs. It was Dutch women who were just training alongside our WACs, but they never actually joined the Women's Army Corps. And there's all of these wonderful other stories. I mean, we could probably be here for 6 hours. I don't know that anybody wants that, but there's so many different topics, and the training centers are the one universal experience. Like, no matter where the women ended up serving, they all went through a WAC training center at the start of their service, and sometimes came back through for additional training, for overseas training, things like that. And then the last big change that happened was the last year of the war. So the WAC was created as an emergency reserve. They were only intended to exist for the duration of the war plus 6 months. And they start talking even late 44, about the same time the Battle of the Bulge is kicking off. They're announcing that they're going to close the 3rd WAC training center. The other training centers, other than Des Moines, have all been closed by this point, and moving everything back to Des Moines. But because of the number of casualties at the Battle of the Bulge, and the growing casualties through that winter, they realized that we actually need to just shift where we have WACs, that we need to start putting them into other roles, and they move a lot of the efforts into gaining WACs as medical technicians. Now, they're not nurses, but they're providing some of that support work to help nurses maintain the level of professionalism and training they have. And so all recruiting efforts shift to bringing women in as medical technicians. They create a medical technician fast track training at Fort Oglethorpe, where you go straight from basic training into your medical technician training. And it's all to prepare for GIs returning back to the States who need medical rehabilitation.
Oh, yes.
We're now looking at the war is winding down. Rehabilitation is what we need to focus on next. And so they put, again, newspaper articles out everywhere. And it was so successful that the Surgeon General of the Army wrote a special thank you to Elizabeth Strayhorn, saying that without the efforts of the 3rd WAC Training Center, that the rehabilitation efforts in 45 and 46 would not have been as successful as they were. They wouldn't have been able to pull it off without that training going on. So again, duration plus 6 months, war is winding down. They stop recruiting in 45, realizing that after VJ Day is probably not long behind. Fort Oglethorpe does actually get shuttered in July of 1945, and they start looking at the end of the WAC. So whatever training efforts they have left moved to Fort Des Moines. They closed them in 46. And the WAC is intended to just disappear after that. The war is over. We don't need emergency reserves. All of the women branches were supposed to demobilize and go away. The only one that actually succeeded in that was the Coast Guard. The SPARs were the only ones that made the full demobilization. And part of it is because the WAC was so successful at what they were tasked with that even before the 6-month demobilization, there were discussions of how can we keep this going. So they went from a peak of 99,000 women and change in January of 45 down to under 2,000 women still in the Corps. And they are all sent to DC, and they're tasked with basically making their own survival. And they do it. And in 1948, President Truman signs the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, and it creates permanent places for all of the women's branches within the U.S. military. Trainings move to Fort Lee, and it continues from there throughout the rest of the 1950s, 1960s, and most of the 1970s. The Women's Army Corps continues. Training bounces around a couple different places. And then in 1978, the WAC is disbanded. Women are fully integrated into the U.S. Army at this point, and they train alongside the men. So
Wow.
That's kind of a varied overview, very casual. I did this talk at the
brilliant
a few years ago. It was much more formal.
Well, it's brilliant. And there are a few questions that have been building up, which I will throw at you.
I have lost sound.
You can still hear me? No?
Yep. My AirPods are dying, so let me see if I can change my settings real quick.
Okay. Well, if you can hear me, Kevin is asking, what is the biggest myth regarding WAC or training you would like to see disappear?
I think the biggest myth I would love to see disappear is the confusion between what the WAC did versus the other women's services.
Yeah.
A lot of what I get when I go do presentations to the general public who may have a passing interest in World War II, but not a deep knowledge, is they ask about WACs serving as pilots. And they didn't. Right. That's what the WASP was for. Or, I'll hear the portmanteau WAC nurses. That is not a thing. And I usually use that as a way to correct and direct them towards the WAC medical technicians.
Yeah. I mean, that seems to be a thing that I think I don't know why, but in the UK, I think there's a better understanding of the separation of the jobs. But I find that people I speak, it gets a bit muddled up with the Americans and who does what. As you say, nurses are the nurses the same as the army? Are the people delivering the post the same as the people in the aircraft? And anyway, so thanks for answering that. Great question from Veronica. And thank you for your contribution, Veronica, earlier. Were these ladies entitled to the GI Bill? And if so, how often was it used? I'm guessing the answer is going to be no, but I will be prepared to be proved wrong.
So they were entitled to the GI Bill. So the way the GI Bill is written is it does not limit by how you served. If you were a man or a woman, if you're black or white, everyone who served was entitled to the GI Bill. And part of that is because the person who wrote the GI Bill, or one of the co-authors, was Edith North Rogers, who wrote the WAC bill.
Right.
So So she like, again, started the war with promising herself that women would not again serve with the U.S. Army without the protection that men got. So she made sure the GI Bill was written to ensure that. However, women did not use GI Bill benefits at a rate equal to their male counterparts.
Mm.
And it's, the knee-jerk reaction to that was, oh, it's because of sexism. They were excluded from using it. And it's more nuanced than that. It's deeper than that. So yes, you did have some examples, like there were colleges throughout the U.S. that women could not attend at the end of World War II. They were men-only colleges. But the other thing you also have is, back to the beginning in those recruiting standards, a lot of the women entered with a college degree. And even if it's free, I don't know about you guys, but I sometimes get tired of school. And if you already have the degree you want, you have already reached the educational level that you want to attain, you're not going to use the GI Bill and go back.
Yeah.
So yeah, or you just have the normal social expectations of you get married and it's the man who's signing to buy a house, the man who's getting
Yeah.
the loans. So WACs were using it. It was just not a proportional rate to how the men were using it.
No, that makes sense. Quick, odd question from Simon here. Were there any celebs who served in the WACs? He's referring to the young Queen Elizabeth serving in the ATS in the UK. So, I mean, we mentioned Lana Turner in the film there, but were there any people that we would know who served in the war?
So you don't have celebrities quite at the level of the Queen.
No, that was quite a
Probably,
name drop from Simon there.
yeah, probably one of the most famous women of the WAC going into the war was Grace Thorpe. And she was the daughter of the athlete Jim Thorpe.
Jim
And
Thorpe,
she
yeah.
was kind of put up as a tokenized Native American in the service. She was a recruiting officer, but she did up in the newspapers a lot. Unfortunately, the WAC did not seem to attract bigger names like a lot of our celebrities that were big then stayed doing war bond drives and helping the effort other ways, Staged War Canteen. I will give a shout out to the U.S. Marine Corps Women's Reserve. The actress B. Arthur was
That
a
all
woman
came up
Marine.
in the sidebar. Yep, she was there, wasn't she? Yep, yep. Thank you. An old one from Terry here. Were the women who went into the OSS originally drawn from the WACs?
Some of them were. Some of them were pulled from the civilian population. It was not a requirement that you had to be in the WAC to join the OSS. It was a bit of both.
Right.
So yeah, and same thing when we talk about like the code girls and the cryptanalysts. It was WACs, it was waves, and it was also civilians. You had we were really big into acronyms. We also had the wires, and those were civilian women who worked in signal efforts that way. So yes, some, but not all.
Okay, thank you. Terry also asked, how strict was the WAC on the age limit of 21? And you talked about the upper age limit as well. I mean, as you said, they were changing certain criteria as the war went on. Well, all branches and all services were, but well, there's the question: did they flex on the age of 21?
So they were strict, but they weren't. And there's tons of examples of women under 21, and they eventually lowered it to 20. And even under 20 joining, but you had to have parental permission.
Right.
So your parents had to sign off. And some of it was all volunteer. And again, the weird experiment, they're being stricter on who they're letting in. It was harder to become a private in the Women's Army Corps than it was to become a lieutenant in the Men's Army. So you have to have all of your paperwork in order. And they're doing very heavy duty background checks. You have to have like letters of recommendation from people in the community to join. Like they're getting pretty hot and heavy and hard on those things. So you don't have any examples of like the 14-year-olds joining the U.S. Navy and ending up on a ship in the Women's Army Corps. But you do have like some 19-year-olds, 18-year-olds who have the permission to join.
Thank you. The predictable question, but it doesn't mean it's a bad one, from Ian earlier. What was the equivalency of pay between the various women's forces units? So amongst the women's branches and, of course, compared to the men?
So I don't have a handy answer of pay between WAC versus nurses versus, waves and those things. If you shoot me an email on the website, I will do what I can to look that up. But I do have an answer on WAC versus GI. So at the beginning, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps members were paid slightly less, but that was quick. That was fixed even before they dropped the auxiliary status, and they were paid the same. So a private GI versus a private WAC paid the same, and women even received overseas pay. Now, you didn't get the extra bonus for combat pay, but they did fix the pay discrepancy pretty quickly. So it was one of those examples where it wasn't a woman earning 82 cents on the dollar. They were earning the same. And they were also able to take out life insurance benefits, all of those things as well. The big thing before they dropped auxiliary status that was not the same was they couldn't get free mail. So they had to pay postage to send letters out of their own pocket. They did not receive free service member rate until after dropping auxiliary status.
Okay. And the last question is from me, actually. And it's going to be, as a historian researching this subject, I mean, when we think of male units, I don't know, like the 101st Airborne or the 6th Marines or something, you have that kind of splurge of memoirs coming out in the late 40s and 50s and 60s. And you have mentioned a couple of books today, but did the WACs kind of do that? Was there a period, so 15 years after war, where a splurge of books came out, or are they thinner on the ground than, I know it was a smaller number of women involved, but were there equivalent books?
So yes and no. This is the historiography of the WAC is another one of my favorite little rants. So you get this spurt, even during the war. I mentioned Elizabeth Pollock writing hers. You get this spurt immediately during the war of women writing their memoirs, and it's not a ton. It's a handful of books, and then it's almost like as soon as they got home and were discharged and returned to civilian life, we just, pulled the brakes really hard on it. Yeah. And part of it's the remasculization of society in the post-war period. Yeah. The men are coming back, they're re-entering the workforce, women are getting pushed back into the home. You see that shift in norms, social and gender norms into the 1950s. And then you really don't see anything until you get a few in the 1980s, but it's really that 50th anniversary in the 90s that you get that boost again. And a lot of women published their memoirs in the 90s, which I wish they would have done in the 50s and 60s when they were closer to the events happening. You didn't have that fog of memory. But that 50th anniversary did wonders. And then it kind of fell off again after the 50th anniversary. And in the 2010s, you start getting a few more popping back up. And now it's moving out of direct memoirs into biographies and studies of the WAC. But yeah, there were a bunch that came out in the 80s and 90s, and they were mostly self-published. Like, they are the crummiest little books you could possibly want. Like, lucky if there was an editor paid. I have one that I've bought 3 versions of because it keeps falling apart because it was such a bad publication house. But yeah, it wasn't the 60s, John Wayne movie era when we get that establishment of it, that Elizabeth Samet talks about in her book, Looking for the Good War. It came much later, and then was a very brief blip and went back. And I feel like we're now into a renaissance of it.
Yeah. And I'm it's interesting just to wind things up that you came at this from a living history background, because that was my background. And I'm from the era when it was occasional girlfriends brought along, really, but it just because the gear wasn't available was one of the biggest, but you couldn't do it. You could kind of dress as a civilian, but it just wasn't available like it is now. But definitely for me, I'm reminded of, I think Sophie Green as well, the work she's doing with the 8th Air Force. And my friend Nikki Reynolds has been writing about the Women's Land Army in the UK. I think it's living history is actually now, women in living history are pushing the envelope in a way the men are not, because in a similar way to the making themselves stand out in World War II and overcome those hurdles, the same kind of thing is applied now. And I know quite a few women living historians and reenactors who are really, really taking the subject and the history on in a way that the men aren't. So that it's interesting that Renaissance revolution has happened as well. That people like yourself and Sophie have come through from the particular field you came through, and now you're moving into the academic field as well. So you sort of started in one lane and hopping lanes mid-career, which is fantastic.
Well, and it's been fun to watch the change. Like I mentioned growing up in the hobby. I did my first reenactment at a month old. I thought that's just how you went camping as a kid.
Nice.
And, the earlier time periods were much more family friendly, even though there was still the heavy focus on everything operated around the mock battle. And then I shifted into World War II, and I came from, with the American Revolution, there's a couple organizations that kind of run most of the events, and the events were juried. So you had to, in the 90s, take Polaroids, mail photos of yourself in, prove that you could meet the authenticity standards. And then I jump over to World War II, and I'm like, who do I mail my stuff to? And they're like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, what are you guys talking about? And the first event I showed up to, it was like, oh, you're a woman, you can just go do whatever you want. I'm like, oh, okay. All right, well, I'll figure it out. And I had like a 1940s dress. I was doing civilian, my first event. I bought it at the antique store. I'm a bit of a clothing nerd, so at least I knew the dress was correct, but nothing else was. It was close enough, one of those. And then even when I started, like, there were some reproductions, but you really had to struggle to put a full uniform together.
Yeah.
With reproductions. And now, especially after the 6888 came out, there's several vendors that you can just buy the whole package because it's leftovers from the movie. And it's much easier. And running a living history group pre-pandemic, I'd have the, you know, here's where to go buy things, here's where to source stuff, here's what to do. Whereas the guys would just show up and they'd have loaner kits for almost an entire extra company.
No, it's been fascinating to see. I mean, I just kind of, I don't partake anymore, but I watched from afar. A lot of my friends are still doing it, and I'm seeing that I don't want to go down a massive rabbit hole. I think some things have not got better for my day, but one of the things that's absolutely got better and pushed ahead is the women. I'm thinking about the women in the UK who do the ATS anti-aircraft crews and the searchlight crews and things like that. It's amazing stuff they're doing. So, but anyway, people are putting repeated requests in to invite you back, and you've got a couple of other ideas you pitched me. So we'll set that up for sometime in the future. But in the meantime, absolutely fantastic first appearance. People have really enjoyed it, and we'll do it again. So it's been great talking to you, Molly, and we will keep in touch. So again, folks, Molly's website is in the description below. I put the QR code up earlier on. There's lots of good stuff there. And I'm back next week with all sorts of things. We're talking talking Churchill. We're talking Marine VMF squadrons, all sorts of things coming up. So click like and subscribe. And I will see you all next week. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, viewers. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.